The American ideal of limited government is on life support. Is it time for civil disobedience? Charles Murray says yes. Murray has been writing on government overreach for more than 30 years. His new book, By the People, is a blueprint for taking back American liberty. I sat down with Charles at the American Enterprise Institute to discuss civil unrest in Baltimore, the scope of government, and why bureaucrats should wear body cams. I figure the best place to sort of start in your wheelhouse is the situation in Baltimore. We are talking about a week after the initial riots, and there's been an enormous amount of debate. There's been a huge debate about whether or not it's racist to call people thugs, but not a whole lot of debate and conversation about the causes of intergenerational poverty, the reason why these neighborhoods are doing so badly, and I was wondering if you had a take on where all this is coming from.
Well, the Baltimore situation makes me want to scream, this is old stuff. I mean, I'm old enough to have remembered what Watts was like back in '66 or '67. And what was it? We had 16, something like that, race riots in 1965.
Right.
I mean, and then we had, during that period, or the 10 years thereafter, we had the recognition that, gee, there was something really different about inner city, big city neighborhoods than elsewhere, and it was really bad to grow up in those places. Now, we're at 2015, you have this riot in Baltimore with exactly the same litany of complaints about what inner city Baltimore is like that you had back in 1965. Right. Furthermore, you have had, in the intervening 50 years, you have had in most of these cities overwhelmingly Democratic control, implementing Democratic solutions. And then I'm supposed to be moved when President Obama says, oh, we know how to cure this if only we had the will.
Right.
No. The big news about the situation in Baltimore is that it's not news.
Right.
It's been with us for a long time, and the nostrums that have been proposed by the left, or for that matter, by most of the right, aren't going to do a damn thing about it.
Well, it was interesting you say that, because I must, I monitor a lot of mainstream media, whether you call it monitoring enemy broadcasts or not, that's up to you. But this idea, or this talking point, just sort of spread like wildfire from Morning Joe to NPR to all around about the main causes for the riots that the Kerner Commission found 50 years ago. And they were like, isn't it amazing that these are the same conditions that we're seeing today in Baltimore? And the lack of self-awareness, or at least appreciation of what, I mean, they all appreciate the irony, but they don't appreciate the depth of the irony that, maybe 50 years of Great Society programs aren't the solution to these problems, and yet that's what you hear over and over again.
I have not yet heard anybody refer to this as an example of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different outcome. What you get is the same solutions tried over and over with slightly different rationalizations for the lack of progress. And the explanation from a social scientist perspective is real simple. You have solutions that are tried, and a really rigorous analysis shows no effect. The cold-blooded, hard-headed evaluations using good data show no effect, no effect, no effect with depressing consistency.
Well, that's Murray's law, right? That it.
Yeah. I thought I was contributing something new to this conversation.
So let's move out to the sort of broader picture for a moment. We were talking about the Great Society and its imposition of, or its assumptions about how people work and all of these kinds of things. One of the overriding themes, it seems to me, going back to losing ground, is your conviction that complexity from the federal level almost always backfires. Or am I wrong about that?
The complexity has a whole bunch of different aspects. So one aspect of the complexity is that teaching kids is actually a pretty simple thing. It becomes rocket science in today's bureaucracy because to do something really simple like operationalize the precept, children cannot learn in a chaotic environment. Therefore, when a child in the classroom is creating a chaotic environment, you get that child out of that classroom.
Right.
The complexity of the system we have now is, first you have 6 different school of education theories of why you should leave the chaotic child in the classroom. And even if they say, well, we should get him out, then you have 25 pages of regulations about how you get them out of the classroom.
Right.
So part of it is just this stupefying complexity of applying rules. And another aspect of it is that you have to have a rule for everything. So that in getting this chaotic child out of the class, to continue that example, you probably, I'm making this up because I don't know for sure, I bet there are a long list of guidelines as to exactly how much physical contact you are allowed in getting a kid out of the classroom. And if you violate any of those, you got a problem.
But in terms of the education and bureaucracy, which you were just talking about, it seems to me that the rules that they create and the monopoly that the education schools have on the pipeline for teachers is a classic example of sort of public choice approach, which says that this is a reward for the guild and less about the students, right? That this is, you know, bureaucrats make rules, and the more rules they make, the better it is for them because they're the ones who get to decide the rules. How much of this, how do you separate out the sort of very deeply cynical idea that this is all sort of self-dealing in the system, which is some of the stuff that you talk about in here, and how much of it is just well-intentioned, unintended consequences?
You know, I doubt if anybody goes into the teachers' union saying, how can I make life better for the teachers while screwing the kids?
Right.
I mean, there's always an internal rationalization for why you're doing what you're doing. But I'm with you. Sometimes the things they end up doing seem so patently to hurt the kids with some of the work rules and the rest of it. I ask myself, how can they even rationalize that to themselves anymore? And here is where I can't get inside the heads of the bureaucracy. So what I'm about to say is not data-driven about their inner feelings, but what it looks like. What it looks like are people who are making a pretty good salary relative to what they could make in the private sector. They have terrific job security. They are not being judged on the quality of their performance relative to creating a clean environment or educated kids or anything. They're being graded on the basis of how well you operate within the bureaucracy. I see a kind of demoralized, cynical population of people working within the government who, when they encounter people in the private sector, tend to do what bureaucrats have done for centuries. I have the power, I have the ability to say no, I have the ability to make trouble for you. Human beings, unfortunately, seem to like that kind of situation. They like to take advantage of that kind of situation. And that's actually what led me to write the book. Just a friend of ours who was victimized by this with a person who essentially said, unless you do what I say, we're going to put you out of business on a trivial issue. That seems to be the way the government operationally functions as you encounter it from day to day. Maybe their hearts are in the right place, but it sure doesn't look that way.
Yeah, I mean, that was, it's funny, when I was reading the lawlessness section of the book, I kept thinking back to, you know, Edmund Burke, and Edmund Burke's fundamental, the sort of the Rosetta Stone for understanding where Edmund Burke would come down on any issue of the day, you know, from the impeachment of Hastings to the supporting the American Revolution and hating the French Revolution, was the abuse of arbitrary power, right? The arbitrariness, which is fundamentally just lawlessness. And one of the things I liked in the book quite a bit, you know, it talks about how at the operational level, the way the law works, you know, and was it Philip Hamburger has written a lot about this, you know, that administrative law, the way bureaucrats operate is purely arbitrary power, right? I mean, it's when you have an infinite supply of regulations, you can always find the regulation you want to empower yourself, right? It's like Felix the Cat's magic bag. You can find whatever you want in there. where you're coming from in this is very, I know this is not a new sensation for you, but where you're coming from this is sort of at odds with the zeitgeist, right? The intellectual zeitgeist.
The intellectual zeitgeist.
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, no,
not the popular zeitgeist.
Not the popular. I mean, that's one of the most intriguing things, I think, of the political moment is that there's the Venn diagram overlapping the sort of Elizabeth Warren arguments and the Tea Party arguments is much bigger than people realize. The disagreements come with the remedies, right? But the complaints about big institutions are
that has
transpartisan.
energized both the Tea Party and Elizabeth Warren, right? I agree.
So, you know, let's put it this way. What do you think of the sort of the Elizabeth Warren explanation? And I'll just characterize it or mischaracterize it as I see fit. That basically it's the big banks and, Charles Murray, you talk about the bureaucrats and the lawyers and the politicians, but you've got it all wrong. They're the people who are trying to help. The people who are hurting are the one percenters and the billionaires and the Wall Street and the fat cats. They're the ones who are really pulling all the strings.
Yeah, I just find that it has a nugget of truth in it, insofar as you have what I call collusive capitalism, whereby you do have the big banks and the big corporations in bed with big government.
Sure.
So if you are talking, well, the financial Dodd-Frank is the classic example. Right. The big banks like it.
Right.
And they've said so openly.
Yeah.
And the reason they've liked it, Jamie Dimon, I guess that's Chase, JP Morgan?
Yeah, I guess.
Who said, quote, that Dodd-Frank gives his corporation a bigger moat.
Right.
To keep out smaller competitors who can't handle the regulatory apparatus.
Right.
But that's been true throughout big corporations. So I am willing to, carry torches into the charge on the corporations, charging them with behaving wrongly, but they're doing it with the help of government.
Right.
If you then say, well, how is it that Exxon is using its vast power to oppress me when it's not acting collusively, I'm kind of hard put to find anything. And my general attitude toward great big corporations is they seem to be trying very hard to give me ever more reliable cars,
right.
Ever more powerful computers, ever better teeth whiteners, you name it. The private sector still does a really good job of sort of catering to the customers as best they can,
right.
and spending millions of dollars trying to cater to them. The evil things they do, I love the quote from Friedrich Hayek that I use as one of the epigraphs, where he said, the power that a multiple millionaire, he was a Brit, so
right.
he had, the power that a multiple millionaire has over me, even if he is not just my neighbor but my employer, is much less than the lowest, most insignificant official in the state who has it within his power to tell me where and how I may live.
Right.
And that's the difference. Exxon cannot come to my door and say, fill up your tank with super,
right.
or you're going to jail.
Right.
The government can do that to me on 1,000 things.
Although it can with the help of government.
Oh, if it creates a monopoly,
right.
It can have its stooges in the government come to my front door and say, guess what? The only option you have anymore is to buy super.
The Obamacare model, mandate you must now use super, right? You must use ethanol.
Yeah,
there's all sorts of things like that.
But I have as many complaints about the way capitalism is practiced as Elizabeth Warren does, if you just take
sure.
the total number of complaints
sure.
I have. And I have the same kind of antipathy, a personal, visceral dislike of the business executives who behave this way. I think they are betraying something very important about how the world ought to work. But what we're talking about here is a perversion of what capitalism should be. I think that one of the things that the economist Mansur Olson teaches us, that when government has a lot of favors to sell, the cat's out of the bag, and that you will end up with a government that has no limits on its power, and a government which is, as Mansur Olson would put it, suffers from institutional sclerosis, right. which pretty much prevents it from doing anything useful. That's not a perversion of government. That is what government does when government has the freedom to do lots of things.
Right. You know, that famous line that people always misinterpret from Adam Smith, where he says, you know, you never get two businessmen, people from the same industry, talking to each other where they don't try to collude against the customer, which is true.
It's absolutely true.
But the problem is they, as we know from Schumpeter and others, you can't collude against the customer successfully for very long without the government helping you, right?
Exactly.
So, are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Long term, I'm optimistic. And of course, I'm reminded, as we all are, of Keynes saying, in the long term, we're all dead. I have had this thought in my mind ever since I wrote a book called In Our Hands. The thought that I've had is 200 years from now, we're probably going to be way wealthier than we are now. If you look at GDP throughout the West, it's been quite consistent. So let's say that wealth has gotten much greater. Technology, we can't even imagine what the technology will do, but just take the degree to which technology has empowered us now and imagine what that's going to be like 200 years from now. Am I supposed to believe that under conditions of vast wealth, of empowerment of individuals over incredible amounts of information and a bunch of other things, we'll still say the best form of government is one in which you have millions of bureaucrats and 16 layers of bureaucracy writing minute rules? I just can't believe that.
Yeah. So, spoiler alert for people who haven't read the book, one of the major arguments that you have is the importance of civil disobedience, though you have a focus on it that you don't usually associate, you know, with civil disobedience in terms of, you know, sit-ins and lunch counters and all that kind of stuff. So
I'm an individualist. I want people to individually go out and...
So why don't you talk about civil disobedience for a second? Because the idea of getting to the optimistic scenario in the long run, at least in your guidance, depends on some civil disobedience, right?
I want to drag the regulatory state kicking and screaming to behave like state troopers on highways. Right now, we as individuals who ignore regulations are like someone who's going down an interstate that's deserted. And the speed limit is 65 and we're going 72. You might get pulled over if it's an isolated, because you could have a state trooper who hasn't filled his quota, maybe he's just bored, he pulls us over. But you and I know the flow of traffic on a typical interstate when the speed limit is 65 miles an hour is at least 72. We're all going that fast. And at that point, the state troopers say, okay, we'll pull you over if you're going way faster than the speed limit, or we'll pull you over if you're driving erratically. Otherwise, we'll leave you alone. The whole strategy that I have is to have ordinary citizens, with regard to regulations, be put in the position of a place where the flow of traffic is 72 miles an hour. And yeah, they're breaking the law, but they aren't hurting anybody. And so you get a no harm, no foul enforcement of regulations, just like they have in professional basketball, where they could call a foul every trip down the court, but they don't unless it affects the play. And if we could do that, the regulations would still be in the books, but they would be enforced on the basis of, did anything really get hurt?
Right.
And if the answer is no, let the American people play.
Also, state troopers actually have to behave in a very rigorous manner, right? And particularly in the era of body cameras, right?
Yeah.
So would you want body cameras on bureaucrats?
Yes, yes. If we could get body cameras on bureaucrats, first, it would expose them saying to citizens, try this and we'll ruin you.
Right.
It would also, body cameras of bureaucrats would reveal how they spend their days.
Yeah,
which might bring down the state all by itself.
We get a lot of secondhand porn that way, right? And solitaire. So.
On that note, I think we've had a fine conversation.
I think on that high note. Anyway, thank you very much, Charles Murray. The book is By the People, and it'll be out May 11th.
May 12th.
May 12th. Okay.
But you may pre-order now.
Pre-order now.
Yes.